Ever feel like the more you learn about something, the more complicated it gets?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I feel about this whole Israel-Palestine thing. It's like
Yeah.
every time you think you're getting a handle on it,
Yeah.
there's another layer, another perspective, another historical event that just muddies the waters again.
Absolutely. It's deceptively complex.
But hey, that's kind of why we do these deep dives, right?
That's right.
To try and untangle those knots.
Untangle the knots. I like that. And today's knot is a particularly tangled one, wouldn't you say? We're diving into the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict, trying to cut through the noise and get to the core of what this decades-long struggle is really all about.
Exactly. And we've got a ton of research to dig through today, a really in-depth historical analysis, actually. And our mission, if we choose to accept it,
I think we have to.
is to pinpoint those pivotal moments, those turning points, the
Yeah.
aha moments that illuminate how we got from there to here.
It's about understanding the why,
Yeah.
right? Not just the what.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, this conflict has roots that go back over a century.
You're right. It's not a simple story. Our source material points to the early 20th century as the real breeding ground for this conflict. It's the classic case, really. Two peoples with deep-rooted connections to the same land, both yearning for self-determination. Bound to cause some friction, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And things really started heating up in the 1940s, right? I mean, before World War II, Palestine was already, well, it was a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah.
And then boom, the UN drops the 1947 partition plan. Talk about a game changer.
Absolutely. Imagine a proposal to carve out two states, one Jewish, one Arab, from this already contested land for Palestinian Arabs, a blatant land grab. For the Zionist leaders, well, they accepted the plan, but our research suggests they already had their sights set on expanding beyond those initial borders. No surprise, this ignited the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
A war that had a devastating human cost. Our research cites something like 711,000 Palestinians displaced during that conflict. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around a number like that.
It's a tragedy that continues to have repercussions even today, and unfortunately, the decades that followed only saw the conflict escalate and become even more entangled with international politics.
Yeah, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's like a never-ending cycle of conflict. Fedayeen attacks, the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, each one leaving its own scar on the region and the world.
And it was during this period that the Palestinian narrative of dispossession really began to resonate on a global scale. We see the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, pushing for a two-state solution. And then, of course, there were the Camp David Accords in 1978.
Right, Camp David. It felt like a real breakthrough at the time, a genuine step towards peace. At least it did for Israel and Egypt.
It was a landmark achievement for those two countries, no doubt. But for the Palestinians, not so much. The Camp David Accords really highlighted just how complex this conflict truly is. Peace, it turned out, wasn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. And as we move into the 1980s and 90s, things only become more complicated.
The 1982 Lebanon War, for example. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. Our sources cite over 650 Israeli deaths and nearly 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese casualties. And then there's the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The sheer horror of it.
It's a chilling reminder of just how high the stakes are in this conflict. This was a calculated move by Israel to dismantle the PLO's infrastructure in Lebanon, to try and control the narrative. But it backfired, wouldn't you say, solidifying the image of both sides as capable of extreme violence.
And then, of course, you had the Intifadas, the Palestinian uprisings against Israeli occupation, the first in the late 80s and then again in the late 90s.
The first Intifada, which lasted from 87 to 93, was particularly significant, I think. It wasn't just about land and borders anymore. It became about Palestinian life under Israeli control, the daily realities of occupation.
And the human cost of those uprisings. It's heartbreaking. Close to 2,000 Palestinians dead in the first Intifada alone, and over 1,000 Israelis and thousands of Palestinians killed in the second. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of the suffering.
It's a stark reminder that every action, every bit of violence has a ripple effect. But even amidst all the bloodshed, there were glimmers of hope. The Oslo Accords, signed in the mid-90s, were supposed to be a roadmap to peace, a real step towards a two-state solution.
Oslo felt different, like maybe, just maybe this time peace was possible.
The optimism, sadly, was short-lived. The Oslo Accords, while ambitious, failed to address the core issues of the conflict. And as our deep dive source puts it, that set the stage for what they call an intractable conflict as we enter the 2000s.
Intractable, that's a heavy word. It makes you wonder, is peace even possible after decades of such deep-seated animosity and violence?
It's a question that continues to haunt this conflict as we move into the 21st century. The violence continued, the core issues remained unresolved, and new challenges emerged. But we can unpack those in a bit.
So we're stepping into the 2000s now, facing this intractable conflict. But intractable doesn't mean static, right? Things were still shifting, even if it wasn't always towards peace.
Exactly. The early 2000s saw the second intifada erupt, and it was even more violent than the first. Suicide bombings by Palestinian groups, targeted killings by Israeli forces. It was a cycle of violence that just spiraled, hardening positions on both sides. The research really paints a grim picture of this period.
And this is when Israel began constructing the West Bank barrier, right? It's kind of a physical manifestation of that divide, you could say.
It's a controversial structure, that's for sure. Israel argues it's crucial for security, to prevent attacks. But for Palestinians, it's a symbol of oppression, cutting them off from their land, their livelihoods, each other. It's a concrete example of how security measures for one side so often translate into hardship for the other.
The research really goes in depth on the situation in Gaza during this period. It feels like it's constantly on a knife's edge, on the brink of collapse.
Gaza is a really volatile flashpoint in this whole thing. Our sources detail those devastating conflicts of 2006, 2008, 2009, and then again in 2014, each one leaving Gaza even more devastated than before.
And with each conflict, the death toll rises. In 2014 alone, over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, and many of them civilians. It's just hard to fathom the scale of human suffering.
It's a tragedy, no doubt, and it's here that we start to see a shift, I think, in how the international community is viewing this conflict. Remember that phrase from our research, explicitly punitive?
Yeah, it was talking about Israel's blockade of Gaza, right?
Exactly. The control over the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza. It's hard to ignore the impact that has had on everyday life there.
The research doesn't mince words, even using the term economic warfare at one point to describe those Israeli policies toward Gaza.
Economic warfare is a powerful term, and I think it's used here to illustrate just how devastating the impact the blockade has been on Gaza's economy. Imagine a place where even basic necessities are scarce, where movement is restricted, economic opportunities are stifled. That's the reality in Gaza.
And that brings us to a term that's become really central to this conversation in recent years: apartheid.
Right. Our source material highlights how even human rights organizations, both Israeli and international, have started using the term apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians, particularly in the occupied territories.
It's a heavy accusation, one that Israel vehemently denies. But for many, the evidence is hard to ignore.
It's crucial to be clear about what's meant by apartheid in this context. We're not just talking about segregation here, right? This is about a system that privileges one group over another in a very systematic and institutionalized way. Restrictions on movement, control over resources, the expansion of settlements. These are all elements that have led many to draw parallels with apartheid-era South Africa.
It's not just about historical events anymore. It's about the structures of power, the daily realities on the ground. The conflict has become almost woven into the very fabric of life for both Israelis and Palestinians.
Exactly. And as we get deeper into the 21st century, we see those power structures being challenged and scrutinized more and more on the global stage.
One area where this scrutiny has been especially intense is around international law, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The legal dimension of the Israel-Palestine conflict is incredibly complex, but it's essential for understanding how the world is responding to the situation. The International Court of Justice, for example, has actually weighed in on several key issues, including the legality of that West Bank barrier and the status of Israeli settlements.
So we're talking about international courts, legal rulings. It feels like the stakes have never been higher. This isn't just some regional conflict anymore, is it? This is a global issue now.
You're right. The Israel-Palestine conflict has become a focal point for international law, a test case, really, for how we as a global community respond to claims of human rights violations, occupation, maybe even apartheid. And the courts haven't been shy about weighing in. Like in 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that West Bank barrier, the one that cuts right through Palestinian territory, well, they said it violates international law.
Wow. That's a pretty major ruling. What impact did that actually have on the ground?
Well, it was a landmark decision, no doubt, a real blow to Israel's argument that the barrier is purely for security. The court even called for sections of it, the parts built inside the West Bank, to be dismantled. And they said Israel should compensate Palestinians for damages. But it also kind of showed the limits of international law. You see, Israel ended up ignoring key parts of that ruling. Just goes to show how difficult it is to enforce these kinds of judgments, even when they come from the highest courts.
So we've got international condemnation, we've got legal rulings, but the situation on the ground, it just doesn't seem to change much, does it?
Sadly, that's often the case. And as we move further into the 21st century, the situation in Gaza especially continues to deteriorate. The blockade is still in place. There are recurring conflicts. There's a humanitarian crisis. It's a stark illustration of the human cost of this intractable conflict.
Yeah. You know, our research goes into detail about that 2014 Gaza war, and there's this one quote that really stuck with me. It's from Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant. He said, "There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." I mean, those are incredibly strong words.
They are, and I think they reflect the really dehumanizing rhetoric that we've seen throughout this entire conflict. That statement especially was widely condemned. A lot of people saw it as advocating for collective punishment, which is a clear violation of international law.
It's a reminder that as much as we might want it to be, international law is not a magic solution. It can provide a framework, sure, but it can't force anyone to actually choose peace. So where does that leave us then? What can we take away from all of this? All this research and history and debate? What's the takeaway for someone listening, someone like me who's just trying to understand what's going on and what, if anything, we can actually do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, I don't think there are any easy answers. But I do think there are a few crucial takeaways from our deep dive today. First off, we have to understand the human cost of this conflict. It's easy to get lost in all the political arguments, the historical debates, but at the heart of it, this is about people's lives. Israelis and Palestinians, just everyday people trying to live their lives, and they're trapped in this cycle of violence and mistrust.
Yeah, it's easy to forget when you're looking at maps and timelines that this is about real human beings, families, people with hopes and dreams for the future.
Exactly. And that brings me to my second point. We have to understand the nuances here. There's this tendency, especially in the West, to oversimplify this whole thing, to see it as black and white, good guys and bad guys. But the reality, as we've seen, is far more complicated. There are narratives of grievance and victimhood on both sides, historical injustices that continue to shape the present.
So it's not about picking a side.
No, it's about engaging with the complexity, challenging our own assumptions, really listening to what both Israelis and Palestinians have to say, hearing their stories, understanding their fears. Only then can we even begin to grasp the true nature of this conflict, let alone work towards a just and lasting peace.
A just and lasting peace. It feels like such a long shot sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Maybe by learning more about this conflict, by grappling with all the nuances and contradictions, maybe then we can start to imagine a different future. One where peace isn't just a dream, but an actual possibility.
I like that. An actual possibility. That's something worth striving for, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Well, on that note, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to check back next time for more explorations of the world's most complex issues.